Hey everybody, happy Earth Day. This is Cindy Allen, Editor-in-Chief of Interior Design, and welcome to our special Keelauer Takeover Day, who are celebrating 40 years of design. You heard me right, 4 decades of thoughtfully manufacturing seating and a slew of creative solutions for all the different ways that people work. Now, today I am here with the president, Mike Keilauer, a leader in the industry who happens to also be a great friend. Let's hear from Mike about the history of the company, the highlights of the past decades, and their ongoing commitment to design and sustainability. Here he is, Mike Keilauer. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Cindy.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
I'm so happy to see you, honestly.
Hi. Oh my, yes. I've been missing us getting together.
I know. There are times during the year, everybody out there, that I know I'm going to see Mike, and it's definitely a highlight. And oh my God, Mike, 4 decades, this is amazing.
Yes, I'm finding it hard to believe that the time has passed so quickly, really.
I know. And you know what's kind of fun when we think about anniversaries? It gives all of us on the editorial side, but you two, like a chance to think back about the history. Now, I know it's, furniture is a family business for you, and your dad's name is Ed, and it goes way back, right? So give us like the cliff notes of Ed and how it all started.
He immigrated to Canada from Europe, but what he trained in was leather and leather through saddle making.
So it was called fine art upholstery, right? In the 50s, right?
Yes, fine art upholstery. And his business was really about custom furniture. And then he started to evolve his own brand, and Fine Art International became a brand in the late 70s. And then we all came along. There were, 5 sons. And
5 sons. Oh my God. Wait, first of all, it must have been like a big thing for him to, when he finally came out and said, it's Keelauer, like using your name, right?
Well, we started a brand new company.
Uh-huh.
We had partners,
Wow.
and so he sort of left that, and we started our own family business. So we really started from scratch, because when he left the old partnership, we had to start from scratch.
And then when were you starting to like actually make furniture then?
Yeah, in 1981, we rented a space and started. And he was our furniture guru, but my brother Ron, who was also a tradesman, was an upholsterer and could manufacture patterns and prototypes and all of that. So they were the back end, and myself and my brother Rick were the front end. So Rick was in charge of the processing, and I was the sales, marketing, everything else guy. And they ran the factory, and we started out as a custom shop, and we did custom furniture, and we developed this skill set around really seeing what the market needed and then creating product for it. And then we started working with outside designers, and that's with my father being the first one.
Yeah, so I understand like Ed did a really great chair in the 80s, right?
The Elite chair, which we still sell today. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's an iconic piece. It still looks as good today as it did back then. And I'm thrilled that we have an iconic piece that's stood the test of time.
Yeah.
Some pieces don't, we're in and out of the market. We have several that have stood the test of time, which is very exciting.
Let's look back, because there are definitely breakthroughs, whether it's product launches or things you learned that were happening during that time that helped you reshape the company. So the first was Elite, right? You said it was this, it's an icon, which is so great that you had one. Then there was, I'll name them, you tell me about them. The Tom. I remember the Tom.
Yes, Tom was a great product. But the other thing that, Cindy, that was happening was we were learning about the industry. But we were also, building distribution. We were building our sales forces. But around the design side, we were really trying to understand what this is all about. And we really were reaching out. So Chris Sorensen was our first outside designer, and he had all this experience. And then we found Tom Deacon, who was the golden boy of design in Canada. That's what they actually called him that in an article.
Oh, really?
Really, he was an architect, but he liked furniture because it was smaller scale. And so we learned how to work with designers, We learned how to go to them with a brief, like, here's what we need. And then we learned how to collaborate to bring a product to market.
And I have to say, like, I still have these kind of memories of going to NeoCon and thinking about what we would see, have great expectation of what we would see from you, but also like kind of an editor's eye in terms of like what designers might you find interesting and want to work with. And I always thought that was like your perspective and your viewpoint was always so relevant.
I think we started doing things early. Like today in the contract market at Neocon, every single company has industrial designers. They all have industrial designers on their website. Everyone has been doing that.
Right.
But in the early 90s, they weren't.
No, it was revolutionary. It was pioneering. I know that's what's so cool about looking back. Now, I remember, I mean, you tell me, the Tom, if it wasn't upholstered, it was the chair that had the perfs in the back?
Yeah.
I love that.
Right. We were sort of the anti-Aeron. Aeron was the machine for working. And ours was, we named it Tom, not because of Tom Deacon, but because we wanted it to be your friend at work.
Right.
We wanted to have a personality. We wanted to be softer. And it also, our evolution was also around not just product, but the embracing of design as a concept that became pervasive in our business. Yeah. So we started working with Michael Vanderbijl at that time. Mm-hmm. And then we moved to Concrete Design, who created the Tom brand, which was a huge success.
Again, these are things that you can't have a business these days without all the pieces of the pies, this sort of like holistic approach. But back then, it was like, go to the Keelauer showroom, wow, and so Tom was the first, huh?
Tom was the big one. Yeah, Tom was the first time we really rather than just branding our company and doing product shots, it was the first time that we created like a movement around a product. And we actually at Neocon, the year we introduced it, we had our Keilhauer showroom, and we rented a separate space to launch Tom. There was a picture of Tom, and on the one page on the front of it, it said, "This is Tom." And when you turned the page, it said, "Tom can be bought." And we had some Toms take offense, but it's like, have a sense of humor. Come on.
I remember it, and I love it, and it really was. And the thing is too, like my memories of you, tall, strapping president that you are, is that you were so proud. You're so proud of the collaborations, the designs. You really connect to that, and as an outside person or as a designer, you feel that coming from you, which is very meaningful, I think, for a company.
That's where it's the creative edge. It's where you're always looking forward, and the collaborations are the fun part of the business. Running a manufacturing company and doing the work and spitting out furniture and doing all of that and building your industrial capacity, that's a lot of hard work. It's fun too, but it's the creative side that really gets your juices flowing.
Okay, so another like shifter for you was Simple.
And each one of these things, each one, Elite, Tom, Simple, as we go through this, all reflect a change in the way offices worked. Mm-hmm. And they were all a reflection of technology. So, the Elite chair was at a time when it was big desks and secretaries and IBM Selectrics and all of that wonderful thing. And Tom, it was now all of a sudden desktops where everyone, even the executives, were at their desks typing their own letters and working. So they needed a different kind of machine to work with. And Simple was the next step where people started to work with laptops. Mm-hmm. But you go to a laptop, but you still had to go to a conference room and you still had to plug in. So that evolved a different chair, and Simple became part of that process because it was a very simple, straightforward solution to conferencing. And it was one of the first chairs of its type. Everyone has one now, but it was kind of the first one of its kind at that moment and was very successful. I remember it took a little while to get going just because people didn't understand the concept of it. But once they got it, it immediately took off. And at the same time, knit backs, as opposed to the woven that was hitting the market. We created the knit back, which is more colorful. And so always trying to do something a little bit different so that it became a Keilhauer product.
It would be impossible not to talk about Keelauer and at the same time talk about the long relationship that you've had with our friends at EOS. And that's connected to, is this the first the cahoots, kind of the really big EOS beginning for you?
We started with EOS. We've been working with them over 20 years now.
Amazing.
Probably in 2000-ish. And we were working on a concept for a new way to sit. We were looking at bouncing balls.
Oh my God, that's right. I remember that. With the, what was it called? The squig?
The squig.
The squig.
So we went to them. We saw their work in Europe, and we really liked their work, and so we got in touch with them. And they were just sort of starting out as well. And so we tried to create that kind of seating. And although it didn't quite work the way we wanted to, because it was kind of revolutionary, we were really experimenting. We ended up with a fabulous chair because we learned so much. We learned that men and women sit differently, and how they sit differently, and why they sit differently. And it changed the way that we approached the way we put a chair together. It changed the way that we did our backs. Instead of concave, we made them convex, and a lot of influence there.
I remember the squig, and I remember like that you were looking at everything like research, and the boys too, right? Like a research project. So I like that you said like you guys were ahead of your time in terms of that, but you were really understanding a new way to move. And that was really interesting.
But that was the start. And then it sort of evolved for a few years. And then we had Cahoots, which was a huge, which represented the next change in office. So all of a sudden wireless was everywhere. And I admittedly, we sort of fell into that because what we were doing at the time, we were doing a lot of airport lounges, you know, like the American Airlines lounge and the United lounge and the Delta lounge. And so we had EOS do a study on what do you need in a lounge? And it turns out that, you know, they came up with four concepts. They came up with relax, work, meet, and privacy. And so those were the basis, that was the basis of Cahoots. And who knew that airplane lounge was exactly what the new office was going to look like.
Yeah, exactly.
So we hit it right on the money, and we were sort of lucky, but it's amazing how lucky you get when you work hard, you know, all those great things. But that started our move in a slightly different direction for Keilhauer, because up to that point we were kind of mainly conference with some lounge. Yeah. And then we really became a lounge, more collaborative seating company. And it changed the way that our swivel tilters were done because they were more conferencey. Right. And we became more loungy, and we sort of did that whole thing. Everything
was mishing, you know, everything was merging.
And those influences were starting to come into our everyday design process.
I liked on the Cahoots that it was a wide range of like lightly scaled, and then it was also mobile, and then more oversized. I love that it was like the whole family.
You know, we started having vocabulary conversations because that was a vocabulary. And it was tied together because there was a detail that was, and the boys called it an ypsilon, but there was sort of a Y upholstery that was in all the pieces. They all looked different, but there was this one element that tied the collection together. And when we started talking about families, we started talking about how families work, just like talking about a family. Yeah. They're not the same. They're related. Everyone has its own personality, its own direction, its own purpose. And that sort of influenced design for us from that point forward, because when we started talking about families, and it became quite a success for us to do collections. And then, you know, working with EOS has been fabulous because we go away once a year. We have our big think sessions, and you know, we have a lot of wine and we laugh a lot, and we come up with an idea, and that becomes a new collection.
I love that. You were telling me how you were driving around driving around Italy, right?
We've been to the Alps, we've been to Italy, and we've been out to the Rockies, we've been to the beach. You know, it's just, again, I wonder if the collections reflect where we've been or what we were indulging in at the time.
Exactly. I have to ask you, what does Cahoots, the name, like, where did that come from?
Well, when you're in cahoots with someone, right? You know, that's where the expression came from.
The reason why I ask is because I think a lot of the names have a little bit of a wink, you know, even when it's a small word, even the word Tom kind of has a little wink. And then being in cahoots and squig.
Just, it's simple. We did a program on little black dresses, and, you know, all those things, you know, so yeah.
What about the new collection, Elevate, from them, which I love? It's really beautiful.
Elevate's sort of an extension of the collection that we had that was called Untucked. Untucked was sort of pre-Elevate. Elevate sort of expanded it a little bit. The Untucked collection was that year that we won Best of Show, and it was sort of a highlight year for us. A designer walked in and just sort of looked around and went, wow,
Mm.
you guys really nailed it. And my heart soared, and I felt so
Oh.
proud. I remember I told you, I shared with you what new.
I remember. This is when you're the pride, but I appreciate it so much because
we've been working on something for a couple of years now.
yeah.
And we take it to the show and we set it all up. And I always have pre-show jitters.
Yeah.
It's like, the first night before the curtain goes up. Is everything right? You got to make sure it's right. Is the product, are they going to like us? Sure. Are they going to like the product? Did we hit it? Is our work going to come to fruition? Every year, that's also where the juice is. It's, I can understand why actors act, because the curtain goes up and they're on. And we have the same feeling at NeoCon every year. So
for sure.
Yeah.
And we definitely missed it this year.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my God. All right. Well, we have to talk about this because you and I have had conversations about how the world has changed and how you think about what you're producing and how you're producing. And you've been doing this for a few years now, but sustainability is now woven into everything you do. And I love that you say, because you're very honest and truthful, you say, our goal is to carry as light a footprint as we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we have to rely on so many other people to do what we do. And so we follow sometimes. We need some of the big guys to do things. We push sometimes, we lead sometimes, but we're always moving in the same direction. We sort of started back in the early mid-90s, was when we sort of caught on to the sustainability thing. Mm-hmm. There was a book out by Emery Levins and Paul Hawken called The Ecology of Commerce, mm-hmm. right? And Ray Anderson from Interface Carpets read that book and apparently came into the office the next day, having had one of those moments, mm-hmm. grandkids, and said to his guy, apparently had a big cry about what we were doing with the world, and came into his team and said, "We're going to do this."
Yeah.
And and I met Ray, and I said, "So here's what we're doing." He said, "Just take one step at a time, Mike, and move forward." And we've been doing that ever since. So that was mid-90s. It's the new wave in the last 5 years, but we've been at it for 25 years. And every year we get a little bit better and a little bit better. And so now we're, as you can see from our website, if you visit our website, mm-hmm. it's an integral part of what we do. It's how we're designing our product now. It's everything we touch now. We're really thinking about it. We have a team in-house that reviews it all, cradle to grave, life cycle analysis. We have a corporate sustainability report. I mean, we're really serious about our business.
Yeah. And I like what you said, because there is a lot of jargon out there, but for you, it's this commitment and an ongoing process. And mm-hmm. I think that's the most honest you can be. Yes. And then it translates into product, which I love, because you do have an amazing product with a wink called Swerve.
With a wink, another wink. Yeah, Swerve's exciting. It's very exciting. The whole world is moving to carbon neutrality, as we try to embrace global warming. As a world, we have to have something to measure so that we can see how we're progressing. Because if we just all said, "Oh, let's stop global warming," which is what people are saying, but then how do you do it, and what do you measure, and how are you going to achieve it? Because if you don't measure it, you don't do it, and how do you know what direction to take? So we created a carbon neutral chair. It's a big step for us, and I think one of the first carbon neutral chairs anywhere, because we've been looking, and it's sort of a new philosophy. I think the major design firms are all moving to carbon neutrality, and the architectural firms, and they can't do it without us manufacturers supplying them with the tools to become carbon neutral. They can say carbon neutral, but unless all of their suppliers are embracing it, they can't achieve it. So we're doing our part in the furniture side. And so we did carbon neutrality, it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, who's this Andrew Jones, Canadian designer, right? Who designed?
He's a Canadian designer, yeah. He was not a protege, but a very close friend of Tom Deacon, and they worked very closely together. They've done some work together, and they're good friends, and they're great designers. So Andrew gave us the concept of the chair, which is light and simple and straightforward, but really quite elegant. Yeah. And then our team worked really hard on the sustainability side. None of us are carbon free. You can't say that. Because the moment you deliver the product in a truck,
Right,
You're
exactly.
generating carbon.
Right.
But you can be carbon neutral, which means you measure from the start to the finish of a product. And we don't like to have a start and end, because we're really looking at a technical nutrient cycle, which is what the ecology of commerce was about. It really still comes down to reduce, reuse, recycle. Those are still the keystones of everything we do. But
Right.
now we're measuring the materials. Materiality is becoming the big issue now. Like, what are you actually using? Some are looking for transparency materials, as are we with redless free and all this wonderful stuff. But you measure it.
Yeah.
From how much carbon is emitted here and how much is emitted here and how much is emitted here, and you figure out exactly how much. I think we were talking earlier, 116 kilograms.
Yeah, 116.3 kilograms of carbon are emitted in the swerve chair. Yeah.
In the manufacturing process from start to
finish. In a life cycle. Yeah, in the life cycle of the chair. Hearing from you, hearing your sincerity, hearing you being upfront, like you're saying, like you can't fake things that you don't have control over either. You can try to do the right thing and work and push that others do it as well, right?
I tell you, the whole sustainability world, it's a very hard path.
Yeah.
It's a hard journey, because you'll figure out, okay, we're going to fix this. We're not going to use this material. And so you walk through this door number one, where you've achieved this great success. And then there's 3 doors in front of you.
Right.
You go, oh my God, what happened here? Like, okay, we fixed it, but now we've got another thing. And you just keep opening doors and moving forward. That's how you do it until you get to where you can be as clean as possible.
Right, exactly. So, well, you're a leader in that way. You're a leader in that way, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. So now we've done and the other thing is, you don't want to be a greenwasher. So everything that we do is third-party certified. All the measurement of everything that we do is third-party certified. So we do the work. Someone comes in and checks it and says, yes, of course, that's exactly right. And then we move to the next part, where now we have to buy carbon credits to offset. So now we're going to a nonprofit.
Right, carbonfund.com, right? That's who you're going to.
Carbonfund.com, who have third-party certified. They are the third-party certifier of these fabulous carbon offsets. So we get to go in and do a little bit of shopping and find some things that we really, really like. So we're they in Africa, in Kenya, they burn wood to clean their water. So there's a project now that uses a different technology to help them, which reduces carbon. In Minnesota, they're working on their forests to make them better. And so you can do that. You can keep a tree. It's not like just, oh, we're going to plant 5,000 trees. Right. There's another project that we're working on in the US where, all the big diesel trucks, when you go to get a coffee, you stop and they don't turn the trucks off, and smoke is pouring out the back. Well, there's a study being done right now, and people are working on plugging those things so that they can process the diesel fuel while they're idling, which would reduce carbon significantly. So those are the kinds of projects we're supporting. And that's also kind of satisfying too, because we know that we're doing a great chair, and we're doing some good on top of the great chair. And that's why it's so satisfying.
I love that. And we're hearing from designers all over that they're also very, very interested in knowing how something is made, but also specifying things that are close to home. And this chair is manufactured in North America. So this is a good story, as you said, the full circle, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I go through the history of furniture and talk to people about it and go back and say, these are the models that have influenced, and from when we started, this is how technology affected us. Sustainability is the new material. It's how do we reduce that stuff? Our new Division 12 group, just as an aside, it's a steel company everything's made in North America. So you don't have to bring this kind of fun product in from China. It's made here, and it's well made, built to last, and colorful and all that. But we really decided to get into that business at this time because we wanted to stop the flow of goods from China. We wanted to manufacture locally.
I love that. And Division 12, it is, it seems like a really good, brother or sister to your
Yeah,
family
yeah,
of products, right?
right, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And it's very different from what we do. That's why we
it
did a
is.
different brand, because they have to be branded differently, because we're a serious furniture manufacturer, but
They're fun and colorful.
the Vision 12 is not. They're
Yeah,
irreverent. They're irreverent. Those
yeah,
damn
they
kids.
are, and we love
Damn
them for
kids.
it. We love them for it. All right, so okay, so Mike, so we're wrapping up. This is what I want to know. Do you have I know they're all your babies, I know, but give me a favorite product. How about one that like has a really strong memory for you?
The simple chair for me. But they all have strong memories, because
Yeah.
the Elite chair was our first win, and God, thank goodness it put us into business. So I have very strong attachment to it.
Yeah.
But the simple was kind of the product that really was one that we defined the market. Like we really defined it. We listened really carefully. We listened to what our customers were asking us to do. And they didn't ask us to do that. They just asked us to do other things, but we heard in that this new idea that needed to be satisfied.
Yeah.
And then we created a whole bunch of really cool new things that went with it. And then it didn't catch right away. And I was like scratching my head going, what the heck? And then it hit. And it was a big win for us. And that was very satisfying.
I kind of have a favorite. There's so much good, like good design out there that you're doing right now. But I still love the Reuben by Mark Kapka.
Oh,
and
yes.
I love that. I love that whole collection. It's so sculptural. And that's the other thing about Swerve that we didn't mention, but designers want things that are good for the world, but they also want something that they love that looks amazing. And that one also has that beautiful, like sculptural line. I still feel your passion and your creative spirit and energy for the future. So what are you thinking about?
Well, some people say, what's your best product? And you say, what's my next one?
Right.
I don't know. I think we've done some great products, but I think we're still striving.
Yeah.
We worked really hard. Like, I love us trying to figure out what the next thing is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also really enjoying, which we're looking for new teams now. And I've got long relationships like with EOS and fairly long time with Andrew Jones as well. But we've got these new groups that we're working with right now, like Form Us with Love is a new group.
I think that is definitely something that we see about Keelauer that is so special. Even if others are working with designers, you always find somebody really interesting or really interesting team that's not like the big star they're like gonna be, like you help make them that. And if I'm, as an editor, that's what we're always looking for too.
Sure.
So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for that.
Yeah.
So first of all, you have to thank all your brothers. Okay.
I do. Yes.
You have to give them all a hug. One family, one company bringing great design out into the world. First of all, I want to thank you for your commitment and passion to design and what you're doing for people and the planet, and also for your friendship. It means so much to me. And cheers for 40 years.
Yeah,
oh
40
my God.
Years.
And on to the next 40.
On to the next 40. Okay. Well, we have to say that. Let's
Hey.
let's say 40 more.
Exactly. Well, big love to Mike Keilauer and to Keilauer and everyone at Keilauer. Thank you. We love you. The industry loves you and respects you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and happy Earth Day. I'm Rajagopal, Editor-in-Chief of Metropolis. Unless we put steps in this year in order to reach carbon neutrality by 2030 and reduce our footprint on this planet, we might be facing irreversible consequences for climate change. So there's no doubt we all need to fight climate change. And yes, interior designers too, because everything that we do in the building sector puts greenhouse gases in the air. Pre-industrial revolution, the amount of carbon dioxide, which is of course the primary greenhouse gas that we're talking about in the air, was about 280 parts per million. Today, that stands at about 412 parts per million, probably the highest it has been during the history of human civilization. The building sector actually contributes a pretty big piece of that pie. If you look at that, building operations and building materials and construction together account for 39%, nearly 40% of the world's carbon emissions. That's the piece that you and I are responsible for in our professional lives. And that's the piece that we can do something about. And we've known this. We've known this at least since 2003, when Ed Mazria first published some of this research and this analysis of the world's carbon emissions in Metropolis magazine, and when the AIA 2030 commitment was created, which is one of the primary ways through which architects today track their progress on climate change. What about interior designers? Look at that little parenthesis under building materials and construction. It says core and shell. Well, what we've discovered in the last couple of years, thanks to research by the Carbon Leadership Forum, bodies like LMN Architects, WeWork, Howley Peterson Snyder, shout out to all the amazing researchers who've been working on really analyzing and understanding the carbon footprint of interior design. We now know that interior designers could influence almost 10% of all global carbon emissions. How did we get to 10%? Well, there are two main concepts that you need to understand. The first is embodied carbon. Now, everything that we do in the building industry, as we discussed, results in some emissions of greenhouse gases into the air through some form or the other. It is impossible for us to extract plastic out of fossil fuels, to turn it into products. It is impossible for us to create synthetic fibers and weave them, even to grow cotton and weave it, shear wool and turn that into the upholstery for our couches. It's impossible to do any of that without putting carbon in the air, right? So embodied carbon is all the greenhouse gases that we put in the air when we make things, when we ship them to a site, and when we install them in interiors. The rest of the carbon emissions of the building sector come from building operations. All the carbon that is used when you turn a light switch on, right? And then that switch is being powered by energy generated out of a power plant somewhere, usually out of burning fuels in somewhere else. Right? So those two pieces, embodied and operational carbon, are really important to understand for our purposes here. The thing about embodied carbon is that our buildings are getting more efficient. Now, this is a good thing. Our buildings should get more efficient. But as we use less and less power to power our lights, the less energy we use that and the greener sources we go to for that energy. Here in New York, you can buy a share in solar power even without installing a solar panel on your own roof, right? There are many ways that we're accessing better energy now and putting fewer greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to run our buildings. But if we don't do anything about the greenhouse gas emissions that we've created already to create all the stuff that's in our buildings, this is the picture we're going to land in. Embodied carbon emissions will be almost half of the total for the building sector, which means, again, if the building sector is 40% of the world's carbon emissions, embodied carbon for the building sector over the next 10 to 20 years might be as much as 20% of the world's carbon emissions. So what parts of a building have a big embodied carbon footprint? Now, of course, through research that we've done through these years, as I said, since 2003, we've known some pieces are big, right? Concrete, right, can be sometimes 22% of that embodied carbon figure. Steel can be a big offender. Glass can be a big problem. All of these things do have a big embodied carbon footprint. But where interior design is concerned, we've so far overlooked an essential fact. And that is the second concept you need to keep in mind, which is life cycles, right? Renovations are the lifeblood of interior design. When a building is built, that concrete and that steel is pretty much staying there. There's no additional emissions we're adding to that over the life of a building. But when we think about interiors, interiors are renovated. So every time a tenant moves out, or every time a company decides to implement a new workplace strategy, every time a hospital decides to update its facilities, right? Furnishings, finishes, lighting, all of that is changed out. And when that happens, that is now additional embodied carbon emissions used up. The emissions we've put in the air to make all of that new stuff, that's now going into the space and is attached to that building, right? Element Architects out of Seattle did a fantastic study based on work that the Carbon Leadership Forum had done, where they analyzed their own office interiors. Their building was built around 1960, so there was a certain amount of embodied carbon put in place for the structure, a certain amount for envelope, and a certain amount for interiors. Then in about, sometime in the late 1970s, Element guesses that there was some kind of office remodel. And then in 1995, the firm conducted a renovation. In the early 2000s, another renovation, a small upgrade in 2010, another renovation in 2015. And each time they've added some of the interior's embodied carbon footprint. Now, what happens is that when you add all of those pieces of carbon emissions spent over the years for every renovation, it starts to stack up. And it stacks up to be almost equal to structure and envelope combined. That is a huge deal. That means that actually, even though we've been looking at concrete and steel as big offenders in a building, really interior design might be the other cumulative big offender in terms of the overall life of a building. That means every interior designer, right, when you touch a project, you're adding that little bit, that tiny piece of that embodied carbon footprint to that building. And therefore, you're contributing to that larger carbon footprint over the life of a building. And of course, for buildings that are being built today, there's more carbon efficient concrete that's available. So a 30% of reduction in the concrete carbon emissions associated with concrete is achievable today. So a building built today, that ratio between the embodied carbon footprint of structure and envelope and the embodied carbon footprint of interiors is likely to skew even more. There's another piece of bad news here. All these estimates for the embodied carbon footprint of interiors were made using EPDs today, that is estimates of those products today. They were likely far less efficient when they were actually used in the renovations 20 or 30 years ago. So what that means is that that footprint of interior design is likely even larger in reality than what we're seeing here. Think about it. How often are you being hired for a renovation project? In healthcare, the average is 10 years, hospitality, 7 years, retail, 7 to 5 years, offices about 5 years, and in tech companies, they're refreshing their spaces every 2 or 3 years. Now, in a building that's standing for 100 years, how many renovations are going to add up? Just think about that. And then when we think about the domestic or the residential sphere, in homes, especially rentals, can you think about how many renovations happen in those spaces? So what can you do? There are three main things that we know now already that can make a difference. And I want to acknowledge there's a lot we don't know, but we know now three things that can make a difference. The first is to assess your impact. That's what Element Architects did. This is their office space, right? They used the Carbon Leadership Forum's Tenant Improvement Lifecycle Assessment Calculator. So that's the Carbon Leadership Forum TILCA calculator. It's a simple tool for you to put in the information that you can get from EPDs that you're using for products that you're using on your project to calculate your carbon footprint. We need to start to know what our impact is before we can think about reducing it. The second thing is to specify sensitively, right? So every product adds to that embodied carbon emissions. So what we need to do is really to pick products that have low carbon emissions, but that also address other needs that we have in the interior design industry. Luckily, there are many products like that already out in the market and many more to come. One of the biggest offenders we know from some benchmark studies is office furniture. In commercial spaces. And Keilhauer released its first carbon neutral office chair, Swerve, last year, right? That's a huge option that interior designers have, right? And the same chair is also certified with BIFMA level 2 and with Indoor Advantage Gold, which means that it is also not putting any harmful chemicals in the air. So it has a lot of advantages beyond being carbon neutral. And that is something important to think about. And of course, the chair also contributes to Well and LEED. There are many, many products like this that are being developed now. There are manufacturers in almost every sector who are trying to innovate low carbon products that also tick off all the other boxes for things that we care about in the interior design industry. We don't want to make people sick. We want to create comfortable spaces. The third thing you can do is reduce, reuse, and recycle. Right? The first thing we want to do is try and reduce the amount of materials we use in interior renovation. Second, we have to think about what elements can we reuse from an existing interior. And the third is, how do we think about using both products with recycled content and also using products that are recyclable, and then creating assemblies that can be taken apart easily for either reuse or recycling. But as you do those three things, I would urge you to remember two things that I believe are really unique to the interior design profession and give us a unique advantage in driving for sustainability. The first is that interior design is a relay race. You, as an interior designer, are often hired to address a space that another interior designer years before has addressed, and another interior designer is going to address years from now. That is just the reality of our profession at this moment. So I would urge you to think about who passed the baton to you and how will you pass it on to somebody else, right? So if we start to think about our place as that little brown column that's going to add up, over the years in the embodied carbon footprint of a building, then we start to understand our place within a larger system and also start to have, I think, a renewed respect for our peers and our predecessors and those who are going to come after us as the next generation of designers, and really start to think about how we can address the carbon footprint, successively and cumulatively over time. The second thing I would urge you to remember is that interior design touches lives. Everything you do has an impact on how people use a space, how comfortable they are, how healthy they are, how safe they are, how happy they are. It is possible, for example, that 30% more efficient concrete mix we were talking about, to build a building with a structure that's made of an entirely different concrete mix, and nobody who enters that building would ever know. It may not make a difference in their day-to-day lives. But I can assure you, everything that interior designers do within a space, a lot of decisions that you will have to take, in addressing carbon emissions, is going to touch people's lives. So the question is, not that we can, per se delete out all carbon emissions from our work, which we would love to do as we get to carbon neutrality, but rather to understand, if we do have to put any emissions in the atmosphere, are they worth it? Are we spending our carbon, so to speak, in the right places? Are we using it to give people acoustic comfort, to give people daylighting, to give people health, to give people beauty, right? That is something that we need to really address as we think about our carbon journey in the interior design profession. And again, there are many resources to help you do that, and many beautiful products out there, to help you create interiors that are both beautiful, that are safe, that promote wellness, and that do not have this huge impact on the world's carbon emissions. Again, I will remind you, you are responsible for almost 10% of this world's carbon emissions through the work that you do day in and day out. I urge you to start looking into the alternatives. And if you're interested in joining Metropolis on this journey, we are creating resources for you. If you come to metropolismac.com/sustainability, we are working on a toolkit for low carbon interiors. We are doing tons of exciting things. There are others out there creating resources as well. I mentioned the Carbon Leadership Forum, but also manufacturers like Keilhauer, who you will hear from in a later segment today as part of our Earth Day programming. So please start to seek out the resources you need to make a difference. This is the year of action, again, as the United Nations has told us, and it is time for us to act. Interior designers, your time is now. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Design TV by SANDOW on Earth Day. I hope you have a great day today thinking about the impact that we have on this planet, the relationship that we share with all living and non-living entities on this planet. Earth Day is a great reminder every year of the impact of human activity, the footprint of human activity on the systems on this planet of which we are a part. And it's a day of reflection. And I'm so thrilled to have a fantastic group of people to reflect with me today on the opportunities that we have in the building sector, whether you're an architect or interior designer, whether you're a developer or a contractor or an engineer, all the different roles that we have in this building sector, the things that we can do in the fight against the climate crisis, which is, of course, the large looming challenge ahead of all of us, as well as what we can do to create a more sustainable and more harmonious relationship between all living beings and all processes on this planet. So happy Earth Day, everyone. With me today are Professor Vivian Loftness, who is a professor and Paul Mellon Chair of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University. Vivian, such a pleasure to have you with us today. Also with us is Drew Shula, who is the founder and principal of Verdical Group and a creator of the Net Zero Conference. Drew, such a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day. And we also have Elizabeth Thompson, who is a vice president at USGBC, the US Green Buildings Council. Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today.
Thank you for having me. Happy Earth Day.
So everyone, I'd love for us to start to just get a sense of where you're at. We're on this Earth Day, we're about 9 years to our 2030 deadline. And the IPCC, of course, at the start of this year, again, reminded us, that this year has to be a year of action. So tell us, what is top of mind for you where sustainability is concerned? Vivian, maybe you want to start us off here.
Thank you, Avinash. I think, and happy Earth Day to all of you. I have had the privilege of serving on a National Academy Committee on decarbonizing the US by 2050 and what we have to do by 2030, which, as you say, is imminent if we're actually going to achieve carbon neutrality as a nation. And the first thing a message to the entire audience of Metropolis is the importance of making it clear how critical the building sector is to the solution set. Because if you actually Google greenhouse gases and look at every pie chart, you'll find that buildings are this little sliver. It's split into residential and commercial, and they've literally stripped the buildings of their electric loads. And they've given them to an electricity sector as if that's an end-use sector. So as a consequence, public policy often diminishes the importance of the built environment to the answer. And yet we are absolutely a third to somewhere between 35 and 40% of the answer. So the first thing we need to do is get all those pie charts taken down and replaced by ones where the building sector is clearly indicated, including, of course, the embodied carbon that's in the materials. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about how much of the solution we have already in our hands as professionals. The first would be the 2030 challenge, and the number of firms that have signed on to the 2030 commitment is rising rapidly. I think there are well over 700 firms, large and small, and they're literally ensuring that their entire portfolio, both new and retrofit, is achieving, is driving towards carbon neutrality. And at this point, many of them are 70% below where they were when they started their commitment, which is huge. And we have to get to a 50 quad reduction in carbon by 2050 as a standing load for a nation at large. And the building sector, through efficient new building design, could give 5 or 6 of those quads just through this 2030 commitment. Then for those who are interior designers in this room, the importance of what we pick and select to put inside buildings, all of those electric plug loads are huge. It's another 5 or 6 quads of plug load. And often that is growing as a bigger phenomena as we start to get more and more efficient buildings. Then finally, urban planning and infrastructure, the entire transportation sector, which is a significant sector in the carbon footprint, is obviously compromised by our inability to walk places or bike places or even take transit, right? So ultimately, if we can get ourselves engaged in a transit-oriented development, in building buildings in places where people can walk, building communities where people can live, work, and walk, we can have such a positive impact on reducing the loads in the transportation sector. I think that's enough good ideas from my side. I'll pass the baton to the next.
Thanks so much, Vivian. And that's a really important reminder. We often see the building sector, as you said, represented as a pretty small sliver of the solutions or of the people who have influence on carbon emissions worldwide, but actually, our influence is huge. So thank you so much, Vivian, for laying that out. Drew, what are your thoughts on Earth Day?
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Avi, and to be here with Vivian and Elizabeth, luminaries in our field. So really excited to be speaking with you all today. I think a couple of things that stand out to me, and I'm a startup guy, started a small green building company in Los Angeles, Verdical Group. All we do is green building consulting, and then our Net Zero conference as well, which is a big conference about all the stuff that we're talking about today. One big thing for me is just simplifying the message. We use a lot of terminology that's complicated, and we just need to simplify things as much as we can and stick to the most important data points. I think Vivian mentioned one of the most important for me is that the AEC industry is 40% of the problem, but that's also inspiring to me because that's such a huge positive impact that we can make as an industry. So simplifying the message, I think, is really important. Just to focus on what we're doing, get everybody on the same page. And that, carbon is the buzzword. It's the big thing to focus on. Operational carbon, embodied carbon, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of those discussions today as we talk about the really massive impact designers can have on the carbon footprint of the whole planet.
Right. Elizabeth, your thoughts on Earth Day?
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed how you said towards the beginning of the discussion that what we're doing here is appreciating our relationships with all beings on the planet. And I think that kind of sets the tone for where we are at this particular Earth Day, where we're towards the end of the pandemic. And we've also been challenged in all sorts of ways to increase our understanding of equity and social justice. I love Drew's message of simplifying and taking that broad scope of the construction industry and looking at that as something where we can really make a big difference. And I think that we also bring a lot of really particular expertise. Certainly within the USGBC, we're so lucky to have been able to harness the expertise of all of our amazing volunteers, experts throughout the world, of which Drew and Vivian are 2 of the wonderful ones. And being able to bring all of that expertise, all of those reference standards, and use that toolkit to help substantially transform the way that we think about the built environment. So if a client comes to us and says, I want an X, how can we help that client to use the expertise that we have and reimagine what they want in a way that's more empowering for all people, while meeting our very ambitious and necessary carbon goals?
The thing that I think I take away from both Drew's comments and your comments, Elizabeth, is that, while we're driving towards these goals, there is this kind of a constant reflection and introspection we need to have in terms of, whether we're on track, what we're doing, how we're doing it, what the impacts of it are. But also there's such a huge creative opportunity, and even in the three things, Vivian, that you listed out, right? There's just so much opportunity for us in terms of the things we can be doing to lower carbon emissions. Absolutely, that's our number 1 goal with the climate crisis. But as we're looking at carbon, as you said, Elizabeth, we're looking at some of those other factors as well. And the one thing if there's one lesson for Earth Day, it's that everything is connected, right? I mean, that is fundamentally the message of Earth Day, and so that's really important to keep track of. Vivian, are you optimistic? Do you think that, especially on energy and carbon, which are the two big things we're tracking now, do you feel like the building sector, we can meet those goals? I know you've been part of that recent study. Is it possible? Are we still in the realm of being able to do something about it?
Well, the time is running quickly. We're late I am optimistic. I'm optimistic relative to the 2050 goals. I certainly feel that we need to accelerate a lot between now and 2030 across our professions. I think maybe one of the things that is going to be catalytic to this is not just getting sort of a carbon price or making people aware of the carbon footprint, but tying our response to energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction, tying it to quality of life, tying it to equity. I think we've got a challenge in front of us to sort of rephrase the purpose of what we're doing. I mean, we obviously, one of the main purposes is to live, in harmony with all living things on this globe, and realizing that we have a limited amount of resources. But we have an opportunity right now, especially in this administration, to talk about what does the building sector contribute to jobs? What does it contribute to addressing inequity? How does it provide access to better physical environments? People, walkable communities are a real asset. The ability for kids to be able to walk to school or for families to be able to get healthy groceries. I mean, there's just, if we can begin to turn our dialogue around the outcomes of carbon neutrality and what it does to improve quality of life, I think we have a real chance. And I think we need to find that language together.
Right. Drew, that sounds like a cue for you. At the Net Zero conference, I mean, you're talking to some of the people who are at the forefront for driving for carbon neutrality. And yet, I think, as Vivian is saying, carbon neutrality in and of itself is not just a material goal. It's not just to do with sort of, manufacturing processes of cement and concrete. It has the potential to change the way we live, the way we work, the way we, connect with each other in communities. Specifically, Drew, you talk about climate resilience a lot. Tell us what this idea of resilience is, and how does that feature in your thinking around net zero and zero carbon?
Great question. So I'll stick with my theme of keeping things simple. And so for me, just talking about resiliency, which again is, we use so much terminology in the sustainability world. I just think about it as like thinking about the future, like future proofing, being ready for what's going to happen in the future, thinking ahead. It's that straightforward. And Vivian's mentioning a lot of great points just now. You were asking Avi about, do we have time to pull this off? And we're trying to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming for the planet. A lot of people are working towards 2030. I am really optimistic as well. I'm optimistic by nature, but I do feel optimistic about our ability to get there. I'm in California, and we had a big drought here a few years ago. And I've seen how quickly things changed when the governor, Brown at the time, mandated restrictions around water use for the state. Immediately, there was a 30% reduction in water use overnight. And so once, we've got everybody on this call right now, we're out there kind of, ringing the alarm bells. Bill McKibben is a huge advocate, right, in our community, and there's many others. But as more and more people get on board, and that is happening, it was one of the primary talking points in our most recent presidential election. We saw the debates with Trump and Biden. One of the big questions was around climate change and climate action. So America as a country, and then globally, the United Nations, we're starting to focus on this. And Vivian mentioned carbon tax. Like, that's something that I think will really make change happen very fast once something like that comes out. So yeah, all these things we're talking about at our Net Zero conference, it's very complicated. There's a lot of moving parts with this whole thing, but I am optimistic about our ability to pull it off.
Absolutely. All sustainability practices, in a way, a way of looking at the future, right? As we're building a building today, as we're creating community today, we're trying to project, how is it going to function? How is it going to build relationships with, material flows, with human beings, with, other living things, right? It is an act of imagining the future. And I think there's something inherently optimistic, as you said, Drew, about what we do. Elizabeth, I'd like to bring you in here on sort of, you were speaking about the pandemic, right? And how it has changed our viewpoint. And, one of the, I think, critical perspectives that's emerged that, had been building up for a while before the pandemic, but it seemed like, the global pandemic kind of just, brought it to a boil, which is really looking at health, right? The health of communities, the health of people, the health of buildings, the health of sort of of ecologies. Tell us a little bit about how at the USGBC you've been adopting health as a lens to look at sustainable architecture.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. At the USGBC, we've certainly shifted to incorporate the safety first credits, the credits that give guidelines on how to safely reemerge into our built spaces. And we, of course, also have had this long trajectory of future-proofing, as I think Drew said, where we recognize, similar to how many folks did during the pandemic, that a small investment early in a different action than when we normally take, like wearing a mask, can make a big difference in the future and in the investments that are required to have people be healthy and safe going forward. So we've been really lucky, again, to tap our volunteers and to create those safety first credits. Also, our credits in general, about 2/3 of our credits are indirectly or directly related to health and human safety. And then I think it's about 40% are directly related to human health. So we have always felt that those small investments in using healthier materials, using better things that promote better indoor air quality, are a great investment for everyone. And then often, of course, those materials have important ripple effects in terms of our environmental health and safety.
I think Drew and Elizabeth, you both said this right at the beginning. I mean, this Earth Day, I think just because we've all been part of this global event that, has been felt locally in different places around the world, but, it's something that has, really tied us together in a common experience around the world, something we've not had for a while. It feels like this year should be some kind of a watershed moment for, not just health, but the sustainability movement as well. So I'd love to just hear from all of you, any thoughts you have on sort of what has this year meant to you, like what, or this past year, 2020, 21, what has it meant to you in terms of accelerating maybe some parts of your work? Has it given you new priorities or new insights in places? Are you pushing for, advocating for connections maybe that we weren't advocating for quite as stridently, before 2020? So just to get a sense of, how this year has shifted things for you.
I can start with that one. Yeah, great question, Avi. There's a great Bill Gates quote that he came out with last year around COVID and the pandemic that we've been facing, that I think our global emissions dropped by something like 8%, something like that, which is a huge deal, right? Like we had this trend of raising emissions, and then they immediately dropped because the whole global economy shut down. But his quote was great because it was like, it flipped that and said it only dropped by 8% with the massive, global shutdown that we experienced, so much pain, and it only reduced emissions by 8%. So we have a lot of work to do. It was really illustrating that this year with the COVID response. Shout out to USGBC for amazing leadership, Elizabeth, with the COVID response credits. We've been using those on our projects. It's been super cool to have those available to us on the lead projects that we manage. But Avi, you're asking about one of the biggest focal points sort of in response. And to me, again, sort of simplifying, dumbing it down, we need to stop burning fossil fuels, right? Like that's what we need to stop doing. We need to, gas, coal. So getting natural gas out of buildings is a huge focus right now. So you'll hear people talking about electrification, decarbonization. These are all terms around that goal. To the extent that we can get off of gas, we're really reducing our footprint in a big way. It's one of the big focal points that my company's focusing on right now.
I'm gonna jump in with a slightly different set of issues that have certainly always been on the front burner for me and have risen up in this pandemic, which is the importance of embracing nature in design. I think everyone has felt the sort of pent up, cooped up emotions of being in a physical building, at home, and by and large for days and days and months, and getting outside and being able to enjoy any percent of outdoor living and walking and biking has been a hugely regenerative part of everyone's life. But it actually ends up being a huge part of reducing our carbon footprint. And we really haven't given it full tribute. Nature offers us free light for a lot of hours of the day. It offers us free breathing air, free cooling for a lot of days in the year. It offers us free heating in terms of sunshine, and we do not embrace it to the level we should. And yet we've now realized in the pandemic that we have to increase ventilation rates, that we really benefit from having sunshine. Ultraviolet light is a sterilizer. We're beginning to realize that biophilic content, both inside our spaces and being able to spill outdoors into outdoor work, living, teaching spaces, entertainment, everything that we used to do inside of a sealed box, we're finding maybe it'd be better if it weren't quite so sealed. So I hope that we'll walk away from this pandemic with a completely renewed energy about passive conditioning.
Just love that. Focus on biomimicry, biophilia. Thank you, Vivian. That was awesome.
Elizabeth, any further thoughts on sort of the effect of the pandemic on the movement?
Yeah. I think you also mentioned kind of early on that there is this introspection that I think all of us have been kind of invited to. And while it's been amazing to see that like our green building market has actually increased, spending on green buildings has actually gone up during the pandemic. I think that does speak to people noticing both the value for human health and the essential qualities of making a more sustainable world. We've also really, in that time of introspection and being more in our indoor and outdoor spaces together, noticed the radical shift toward racial justice and toward making space for everyone at the table and listening and bringing humility and getting to know the really hard and in some cases horrible stories that go with that, those different experiences. And so I think that that's something that, especially in my volunteer work, I really appreciated the challenge to come there, and then been inspired by the USGBC's leadership on that front too, where there are a lot of areas where we're working really hard toward racial justice, to educate ourselves as individuals, as part of the USGBC, and to collaborate with our communities as we do that better, and getting to see the projects that we have over the years, and certainly the conversations over the past year during the pandemic, where those values are really coming to light in ways that challenge us and inspire us and give us hope for moving forward.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for bringing that up. And I'd like to actually dive a little deeper into that question of racial justice, climate justice, and equity in just a few moments. Before we do that, I want to kind of round out the discussion we've had around carbon just a little bit, because I think the two are ultimately, of course, like everything, connected. We spoke about embodied carbon, and and in the context of both architects and interior designers. Just to, for anybody listening who, is kind of new, Drew, thank you for reminding us a lot that, like, we have our own jargon, right, in sustainable architecture and design. We need precise language for precise concepts. But I think, just to say, to simplify it, when you're designing a building, the very often we're calculating as energy, the energy, for instance, it takes to turn the lights on in a building, right? And to keep them on over the life of a building, that's called operational energy or operation. And then the emissions associated with that are operational carbon. But, there's also all of that energy that's already been spent to mine the minerals out of the earth, turn them into parts for lighting, make them into lights, ship them to the building site, and then install them, right? And all of that energy that's used up is, of course, embodied energy, and the emissions associated with it are embodied carbon. And while we've all, it's great for building owners and everyone. It's been wonderful for the last 20, 30 years for everybody to really look at, our utility bills are going to be lower, and that's a powerful return on investment for green building, right? That operational energy, I think, we've made big strides in reducing that, even though we have challenges with electrification and so on. From all your points of view, would you mind talking to us a little bit about embodied carbon? That is the carbon that is used, the emissions that we're generating while making all the materials and all of that, and bringing them together and turning them into buildings and interiors. How do we start to shift our focus on that? Why do we need a bigger focus on that at this point in time?
I'm happy to start. I know I'm sure Drew has a lot to say about this as a leader in this field, but there are some big players in the embodied carbon. There are at least 5 really big players: concrete, steel, aluminum, insulation, especially petrochemical insulation, plastics. And as architects and interior designers, we specify these materials with abandon. We're not actually saying, gee, how little concrete do I need to put in to make this a structurally stable building? And there's some wonderful innovations in floor slabs, which is a big use of concrete in addition to foundations, where you use bubble deck as a way in which to do innovative, very structurally, in fact, structurally stronger than just pouring a lot of concrete with rebars. A bubble deck is a little teeny, millions of little vaults created, but with bubbles. So you can do things very innovatively to reduce the total quantities of concrete, steel, aluminum. Of course, wood construction is as an alternative, and the exploration of mass timber and cross-laminated timber is a really exciting, because it not only reduces the footprint of materials, it can actually be selected to sequester carbon, to actually take some of the carbon back out of the atmosphere. Insulation, we probably need to move away from petrochemical-based insulation and move to more benign natural insulation. Plastics, we just need to reduce altogether. And there is something very exciting about this, because it requires a lot of creativity, and it opens up a new palette for designers that actually are biophilic, and it tends to improve the quality of the indoor environment. So I think the focus on embodied carbon is going to be a really wonderful catalyst for the design community.
Yeah, designers, if you're watching this, you hold the power. Listen to us. You are very powerful in your decisions. Yeah, it's really true. Specifying materials, the interior designer or the architect has a huge amount of influence on the carbon footprint of the design of the project, from the embodied carbon that Avi was talking about. And Avi, I know you've written about this, and there's studies out there that show, you've got the initial build of the project, but then every so often, every 7-10 years, you get a new interior fit out, and a whole nother set of products are specified. And that's where you get that compounding effect over the life of the building. Over 50 years, you'll see a huge impact over each one of those fit outs completed. So yeah, be very aware of your selections. And I talk a lot about designers need a third screen. You know, it always used to just be the aesthetic. You're looking at the aesthetic, the design aesthetic, how things look for the client. And the second thing was you're always looking at the cost, right? Making sure you're not selecting something too expensive and staying within the budget. There's got to be a third screen for sustainability, and that's been happening more and more over the last 20 years. But to really, you know, complete a life cycle assessment, LCA, and understand your carbon footprint or your material selection. So that's the tool to use. If you haven't done one before, if you're a designer out there and you want to make an impact, you want to be a positive influence on the climate crisis, start to make a life cycle assessment a part of every project that you work on in your firm.
You know, we're going to be sharing some resources later today as part of today's programming on, you know, some of the tools, some of the perspectives you can use for responsible specification around materials, you know, especially around the carbon footprint and the global warming potential of materials. So, you know, more to come on that. There's plenty of amazing resources out there if you want to educate yourself. But Drew, you know, I couldn't agree more. This industry has the power. I mean, you know, Elizabeth at USGBC, you guys have been, you know, had front row seats and been prime movers in the enormous amount of change we've already made, right? There are so many things in the way we design buildings that, you know, as a result of the green building movement, we just don't do anymore. You know, the wide adoption. And then there are factors that, you know, have changed based on what we understand about health and well-being. I mean, you know, somebody recently reminded me that people didn't put asbestos in buildings because they had fun doing it, because it was just the most appropriate material available at the time. You know, and yet as our understanding of what that material does to human biology changed, you know, now of course we would never dream of, you know, I mean, we have asbestos abatement when we come to a, you know, an old structure, right? We're going to find that many of the materials we use today are going to be the asbestos of tomorrow, right? And so, you know, we have to be aware of that, and we've made huge progress, and there's so much more that we could be doing.
At Keilhauer, we carefully consider the carbon impact from design to end of life, working with third parties to assess and reduce our carbon output throughout the process. The result is the beautifully designed Swerve in a range of colors. The first Keilhauer product that is completely carbon neutral and has zero impact on global warming. We carefully selected material with low carbon features. We offset the inevitable carbon by investing in offset credits and climate change mitigation projects. We are design activists, and we believe that great design and sustainability can go hand in hand.
You know, Elizabeth, I know that you know, at USGBC as well, you know, your lead carbon rating, you know, is starting to take stock of embodied carbon. Is there anything that you'd like to add there in terms of, you know, material selection and sort of the carbon footprint of materials and products?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we do certainly have that LEED Zero program, and that we are seeing more and more projects come through that and earn different aspects of it, and that's so exciting. We also think of carbon, embodied carbon, in sort of three categories. The first one being the design team, and that's where that creativity that you talked about is so exciting, because we have the potential for rethinking what we've decided we need. So when an owner or a group comes to a designer and says, I need an X, that's where we can say, okay, so how can we completely restructure this so that it has the lowest embodied carbon possible, and lowest, of course, operating carbon costs as well. So the design team, as you guys have said, have so much power in order to transform how we're imagining what comes next. And then, of course, the construction team and the product manufacturers have a really big role to play with EPDs and renewable materials and you know, easily accessible content that has recycled products and the circular way of building that incorporates reuse and all of that. So using salvage materials and all of that, I feel like we've gotten there some with LEED. We figured out how to quantify that, and we're trying to do it more simply all the time. But that rethinking is, I think, the most exciting frontier, where we can redesign and create a new imagining of what's possible.
I just want to chime in quickly, Avi, just to add on to what Elizabeth's talking about, related to human health, from the impact of materials on human health. And just like when you go to a grocery store, you can pick up a box of food off the aisle and look at the ingredients that are in the product that you're about to consume. We have not historically had that for building products. We don't know what, crazy toxic chemicals are in the products that we're putting into our buildings. And that's been a big movement the past few years. International Living Future Institute also has something called a declare label that's disclosing and making it transparent what the ingredients are in these products that we're sitting on and breathing in the rooms that we sit in and our kids learn in all day. So it's another exciting movement, and it's kind of different from the carbon impacts that we're talking about, the carbon footprint. This is about disclosure of chemical ingredients and materials related to human health.
Right. And the tools that do both address carbon and address human health sometimes have common ground. Elizabeth, you mentioned an EPD, and EPD is an environmental product declaration. And again, we're going to go into EPDs a little bit further, in a subsequent segment of this program. But EPDs are a designer's best friend today, right? Not every product has a declare label. A declare label, of course, discloses every chemical, every sort of component that's in a product. But an EPD comes pretty close, in terms of telling you at least about the potential environmental impacts that a product might have. An EPD, for instance, estimates through a life cycle assessment the carbon emissions that a product is bringing with it, sort of the embodied carbon emissions that a product is bringing with it into a project, right? And so it's a very vital tool. It's a really vital tool, and I think the more we can educate ourselves about some of those basic tools and how we can use them to inform our work, the better off we are. Of course, it's possible to go deeper and deeper and deeper into this. There's many layers to the onion, and as we peel back one layer, we find we need to learn more and know more. EPDs and declare labels are a great example. They tell you, what chemicals are in a product, but they don't necessarily tell you how they got there and what impact they've had on communities in the process of getting there. For instance, there's other tools for that. There's a just label. You should look into that as well. But that is important because as architects and interior designers, we're not just responsible for the material as it goes into a building. That material also has had a whole life before it ever got to your job site, right? And in that process, not only has it emitted carbon, which we've been talking about as embodied carbon, but also it's affected people through its life, right? And so there's a huge materials transparency movement in the industry. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that, being transparent about, where, and the declarations are part of this movement, where our materials and products come from, and what impacts they've had on the environment before they ever got to our job site, and then the impacts that they're going to have on people who use and occupy the buildings that we design. So I wonder if anybody wants to just characterize sort of the materials transparency movement and why it's so important to all your work.
Maybe the best example of that is the wood industry when they started to certify forests. I mean, the whole idea of chain of custody. Do you know where the extraction occurred and whether they were actually living wages and acceptable environmental conditions for workers? And how far did it travel and what other processing did it go through and what were the chemicals involved with that processing? And I think, and then ultimately, where does it go when it's no longer in use? You talked earlier about Drew did, the number of cycles of change in interior environments, especially in office buildings and retail stores. I mean, there's just a constant evolution of space. And unfortunately with that, there's a lot of waste. And we often just sort of put our hands up and say, well, it's not my problem because it's out of my hands, but it's actually in our hands to select products, number one, that are so valuable that people don't want to throw them away, which changes the economic discourse. If you're saying, I want to buy something that's timeless and that people want to keep, and or designed for disassembly. And I think there's And these are, again, really exciting shifts for the design community that really makes, I think, are very exciting for us as professionals, gives us a whole new avenue of innovation.
Yeah, I would chime in. You know, what's catalyzing change here? A big thing is just the phrase "vote with your dollar," right? That's so important to remember. You vote every time you spend $1, you're voting for something. It's really important to remember that. And so it plays into designers specifying products. Like those are the products that are going to get purchased and installed into a project. And that again, designers hold the power and the key. You guys are selecting products and you're voting for these products. And the more votes that they get, the higher the demand will get, the more will get produced, the more they'll be incorporated into buildings, into the market. So just remember that in your specifications. And then I also wanted to give a shout out to market movers like Google. It's a great example. Google's headquarters project in the Bay Area, in the RFP, they decided that they were going to pursue Living Building Challenge certification. And they were going to go after products that had declare labels. And so all the furniture companies that were bidding on the project immediately went and started getting declare labels for their products. And so it's when a big company, puts that in RFP, it really makes, other companies in the marketplace react. It has a very positive impact, directly in our day-to-day work. And I think we'll see a lot more of that happening beyond this Earth Day in the near future.
I'd love to chime in on that too. I think with LEED, we often talk about telling the story of LEED, and I really appreciate how the discussion has talked about how each of the parts of building have a story, and the making of the project has a story. My husband and I were designing and building a house. We were able to access materials that had been salvaged and wood that was from sustainable forests. We were in Montana at the time, and a lot of the forests there need to be thinned in order to reduce the fire risk. So we were able to work with this amazing man who helped us to use that wood, mill it locally, and then bring it to the site. And at one point I was reading a Dr. Seuss book to my kids, and I'm forgetting the title of it, but there was a movie made of it. Maybe someone else will remember it, but they were sort of saying like, wait, Mom, our house is full of wood. Where did all this wood come from? It was about the borax, there we go. And so to be able to say to your kids, we did our best to like bring our integrity to this house and to this story. I think that kind of story is of course a tiny micro story, but when we apply that and we apply like the research that Professor Loftness brings to things and the large scale of Drew's work, we have that potential to be able to give our kids an empowering story.
Right, absolutely. It really, Drew's been cautioning us not to get too caught up in the jargon. It really is about, understanding where things come from, how they're made, right? And we need to know that because, for a long time, we created processes and products without thinking about, those after effects on the environment and on people, without considering them fully, sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes not, right? And now is the time that we kind of have to go back and almost do this investigation, do this, mode of inquiry where we have to look into everything that we're designing, make sure that what we're voting for with our dollar, again, to steal Drew's phrase, is something worth voting for. How do we put our integrity as design professionals behind, what we do? I have one more thought connected to this that I'd love to bring to all of you. The one other thing that the pandemic has taught us is that, very often these, giant crises, these global crises, and the climate crisis is going to be a slow burning crisis, right? The coronavirus epidemic was a quick burning, crisis. These crises tend to affect people most who have the least resources, right? Who already bear the brunt of inequity, already bear the brunt of like lack of opportunity, and they're likely to be the first people affected. I mean, the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the UN, set this out quite clearly. They said, unless we do something by 2030, we're going to see by 2040 real impact on communities around the world. So I guess my question is, how do we cast a wider net with what we do, right? What can we do that has an impact on not just the people who pay for our buildings or the people who get paid to work in them or live in them or the people who have bought them, but rather has a wider impact in the world. Is it possible for us to do that as architects and interior designers?
I think these are totally interrelated. I mean, there's no question that the wastefulness and the energy, carbon, and material intensity of the past has contributed to the inequities. So for us to be far more conscious of the materials we're using and will contribute to a greater sense of equity. And just very specifically, if you look at infrastructure investments that are potentially going to be emerging in the United States in the next 5 years with some serious speed, and we start to say, where should those infrastructure investments be? I mean, I'm part of a Smart Surface Coalition that's focused on the horizontal surfaces, the roofs, the streets, the sidewalks, the parking lots. And we pave everything, and we pave it with dark stuff. So we create heat islands and we create spaces with no greenery whatsoever. I mean, we strip all the space of greenery and we just pave it and it becomes inert. We have essentially sealed the skin of the earth. And if we're going to reverse that with infrastructure investment, we need to reverse it in a very deliberative way to deliver a higher level of equity. We need to do tree canopies and rain gardens and a continuous green space, green roofs. If you think about a driveway, instead of doubling or tripling the size of your driveway so you can have more cars, what if the driveway went back to being 2 strips of concrete in a meadow, where it's just the exact width of concrete you need to drive into your garage, and everything else is given back to the earth and to the bees and to biodiversity? I think we're at a threshold now of being able to sort of rethink the investments in our infrastructure in a way that not only helps the earth, but addresses and start in the communities that have the least.
Absolutely. Before Drew and Elizabeth weigh in, I just wanted to say we covered this very interesting project in Metropolis that came out of Columbia University, where they overlaid maps with the highest infection and death rates from COVID-19 with the places that have the highest ratio of paved to green space. And no surprise, neighborhoods that have the most paved space are also the neighborhoods with the highest incidence of COVID-19. And that's not because of any direct connection between those two things. Paving does not cause COVID-19, obviously. Yeah. But what it says is that the same social indicators underlie both of those things, right? So it's a really fantastic story, and I would urge you to just run a search for it on the Metropolis site. You should be able to find it. It's incredible how inequity is kind of coded into our built environment in those ways. Sorry, Elizabeth and Drew, I'd love to have you both come in as well.
Yeah, no, great point, Avi. We hit a scary milestone recently too. Many of you might already be aware, but we went above 420 parts per million in atmospheric CO2 in the past month, prior to this Earth Day, which is the highest it has ever been recorded. And I think at pre-industrial levels was maybe 300, I believe, parts per million. Now we're up to 420 just in the past couple hundred years of burning fossil fuels around the planet, pumping them into the atmosphere. It's global. It's the same terminology again. It's global warming is the same terminology for what we're talking about with climate change and the climate crisis. The sun's rays are coming in, getting trapped, and heating the planet. And it's a scary milestone that we've hit at 420 now. I think policy is a huge part of the solution, Avi. Again, I go back to what I experienced here in California with the drought, a few years ago, and a policy immediately having a 30% reduction. If we can pass through a carbon tax and attack the social cost of carbon by making companies pay for their carbon emissions, that will have a very immediate impact. And companies are starting to pay attention. Right now, it's all voluntary, right? There's the leading edge companies are starting to pay attention and voluntarily do some things to reduce their carbon footprints. But if we have a tax that forces everyone to do it, it'll make a huge impact immediately. So big changes ahead. I think companies should start to plan for a reality in the near future where a carbon tax is a real thing. We've been talking to our clients about that now. I mean, they're doing calculations that project, millions of dollars of costs around their carbon footprints that they would have to pay for, so that to the extent that they can reduce their operational carbon, embodied carbon footprint now over the next 10 years as we move towards 2030, it's a big cost savings for them. So something for companies to focus on today on Earth Day.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree. I think when we start to look at the sort of city climate planner level, the scale of change that takes all of the pieces into account at more of an urban level, and we start to incorporate those costs, the long-term costs to businesses, to communities, and both quantify them in terms of looking at what the variables are that affect people who are in more vulnerable positions, and then also ensure that we're paying attention to the qualitative aspects, that we're noticing who isn't at the table and trying to find a way to make space so that more people can be at the decision-making table, so that the experience is truly informed by the whole. And the federal policy reflects that, state policy, local policy, so that the stories that we come out of this next challenge with can reflect all of that expertise, all of that background, and the needs that we might not even think to be aware of. I think the pandemic showed us, if we have any extra, that it makes the pandemic so much easier. If we're able to, at the beginning of the pandemic, buy toilet paper, or if there's a significant event in a family's life and they're able to order food that night so that they don't have to prepare it. I think that those little tiny changes that we might have been more aware of during the pandemic if our neighbors didn't have access to those things and we did, or if our neighbors had access to more than we did, I think that those small experiences taught us to reframe how we imagine what's possible for ourselves and for others. And I hope that we'll bring those forward into what comes next.
Avi, I'd like to just jump in there because it sparked, Elizabeth's comments sparked an immediate response about bringing everyone to the table. Environmental hazards that are associated with manufacturing and power production and transportation and a number of other things, we have a tendency to not, and this of course, it becomes a global challenge, not just a local challenge. We tend to not feel them because we essentially have chosen to live away from the environmental hazards, right? So a lot of the decision makers who are deciding the future of buildings and built environments and infrastructures tend to be oblivious. And the important thing is to make sure that the table is, and who's at the table is completely aware of what the environmental conditions are on the ground, and then committed to fixing them. And I think one of the very early goals under the LEAD program, which I think is critical, which is the 500-mile radius for hiring not just professionals, but buying materials and assemblies. And what it did is it said, we're going to hold responsibility for how things are sourced and manufactured and delivered, and we're going to provide employment. And keeping things within a 500-mile radius means that it's in your backyard. And I think that's going to be an important lesson for us to deal with both equity and regeneration of the planet.
Right. I think, both your comments, as well as I think Drew's comments about corporate leadership, really point to how we need a very healthy participatory movement, a really kind of grassroots movement in order to really make change happen. And I think as architects and interior designers, again, we have the power in terms of who we choose to consult on projects, right? Whose voices we choose to hear, what kind of groups we choose to bring into the room for our charrettes and our research phases and our design development phases. That is a sustainability decision too, right? It's not just about how much carbon or what you specify, but also who you bring in the room and who you're listening to. And Drew, of course, the leadership that we've seen, with some of these big, giants this past year, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Salesforce, you name it. So many of these large corporations have made big carbon neutrality commitments, carbon negativity commitments. And because they're seeing, the events on the horizon, they're seeing that at some point we're all going to have to pay for, what we've spent and what we've put out there, and everybody has to pay in their little bit, right? When Google has to pay millions of dollars in carbon tax, that is going to kind of affect their employees. It's going to affect their larger sphere. It's going to affect all their suppliers and all their partners. It's going to affect, everything has an effect on all of us. We are all connected. And so that's important that, when we bring in, multiple and diverse perspectives, and when we look at things both locally and globally, that's really important. So Vivian, that 500-mile radius that is so key to some of the initial thinking around LEED, is still so powerful in terms of how it can shape our action and our thinking. I would love to kind of, just hear some last comments from all of you. We've spoken a lot about what architects and designers can do in the professional sphere, how they can influence the world for the good, how they can help fight the climate crisis. Is there anything to add in terms of what architects and designers can do professionally? And also, or do you have suggestions for what they should be doing as citizens and consumers, on this Earth Day? What are some Earth Day resolutions we should all be taking?
You hold the power, guys. Everybody's decisions matter. It's really important to remember that. Don't let yourself think that you're not part of the solution or that it's too big of a problem for you to have an impact on. Every individual matters. And most of us in the design community work in teams at work, and you influence the people that you work with. You influence all the other firms that are part of your project. So be an advocate for these issues, for climate-related issues on your teams at work. You guys hold the power. And then in your personal lives, Avi, I think that's a great point. Like these things don't happen immediately, but next time you get a car, make sure you get an electric vehicle. It might be 5 years from now, but do that. Look at solar panels on your home. There's small things, use green cleaning products right at home. There's little things that you can do as well, but make these choices and vote with your dollars. I think that'd be, and stop burning fossil fuels. Focus on that and focus on the carbon impacts of your choices to get off fossil fuels.
I'm happy to speak to another action. I think definitely vote also, but putting our elected leaders and telling them what we want, not just when we vote, but also in an ongoing way of building our own expertise, building the expertise of our communities, and helping to bring those things forward and say that this is the world we want, this is the world we require. At the USGBC, we're really happy to have those social equity pilot credits that emphasize the supply chain, the project team, and the community, and continue to push us as the USGBC and engage with us as a place where we want this expertise to continue to grow. And also just don't stop imagining the world that we all hope will be there next. Let ourselves have as much freedom as possible in creating that, imagining it, and building it one small step at a time. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I might end with 2 points. One is where I began, which is I think we have to get all those pie diagrams replaced that really do tell the story of not just buildings, but the materials in buildings and the land use patterns that are associated with the built environment, and how much impact they are going to have on the greenhouse gas footprint, and how much opportunity we have to really reduce that wedge of the pie. But the second message I wanted to add was just and Drew's right, there's a lot of words out there that, you know, to describe sustainability and all the range of sustainability, but one of the, probably the most powerful is regeneration. And I think the notion of regenerative environments is a way to remind us first to achieve LEED and living, building, and well. I mean, take every standard you can and make it your standard, and then take a step further. And the step further is the regenerative environment, in which we're actually giving back more than we take. And it has to do with sequestering carbon. It has to do with rewilding the world, taking up less land. I mean, to my mind, we are in a transformative moment for the practice, for the professions that are part of the Metropolis family. And I think we have a lot of wonderful opportunity.
Thank you so much, Vivian. And that's such a great note for us to end on. You know, we need to stop at, you know, yes, we need to stop doing harm, but, you know, we also need to figure out how we can do more good, right? What is the positive impact we can have on the world? How can we help the world heal? How can we help ourselves heal? That's a really big, you know, question for us this Earth Day. Thank you all so much for joining us for this session. It's been absolutely wonderful to have Drew, Vivian, and Elizabeth on today's panel. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. Thanks to all our viewers for tuning in. More Earth Day programming coming up. A huge thanks also to Keilhauer, who sponsored this event, and who are partnering with us for a lot of our Earth Day content this year. Thank you all so much, and have a great Earth Day.
Welcome to Metropolis Sustainable Product Spotlight. I'm Senior Editor Kelly Beeman. Today, we're taking a look at Swerve, the world's first 100% carbon neutral office chair. It has earned third-party certification from SCS Global Services for indoor air quality at the Advantage Gold level and is BIFMA Level 2 in furniture sustainability standards. This chair is an environmental and design milestone. Keelauer, the manufacturer, is notable for its closed-loop manufacturing processes, which produce zero waste. And last year, the company achieved an 11% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, produced zero wastewater in its manufacturing, and offset 100% of its energy use with renewable energy credits. With me to tell us what inspired Swerve's breakthrough carbon neutrality and how Keilauer achieved this feat is the company's president, Mike Keilauer. Welcome.
Thank you, Kelly. Nice to be here. Nice to hear all those wonderful things that we've done.
You had to make it happen. You had to give me a reason to say it.
Sure.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Please tell us about the role sustainability plays in your company's product design process.
Well, it's really huge. It's significant and integral to everything that we do. We're a design company, so our success is based on introducing products, significant numbers of products every year. We build the sustainability idea into every single product that we do right at the very outset of the design brief. So it comes in to every conversation as we're developing product. So that's how significant it is. And it's allowed us to achieve all those wonderful things that you mentioned earlier. Because if the product's not designed to do wonderful things, it's hard to achieve the results you're looking for.
Absolutely. You've mentioned in the past that Keilauer's goal is closed loop manufacturing, and that seems across product lines. What does that mean for the products and for your organization?
We plugged into closed loop many years ago. We've been sort of on this sustainability journey for 25 years. And in order to do that, you really have to have a sense of where you want to go and what you're doing. So closed loop for us is essentially, in simple terms, is to say that we use a material, that we create that and we put it into a product, and then we can take that material and recycle it and put it back into another product. So rather than becoming a linear process where you dig it up and you use it and then you throw it away, we're trying to close the loop. So once it's used, it never gets thrown out, and it keeps, or it has the ability to continue to be used as a material in the manufacturing process.
The new chair, Swerve, is carbon neutral. What inspired that decision to make this chair carbon neutral, especially right now, which seems like just in time?
Yeah, well, the world is talking about global warming, and global warming is this, it's the huge concept, and it's a very large concept, and it's hard for all of us to get our arms around what exactly we can do in order to help the goal of reducing climate change, global warming. And so that was what drove us to develop the Swerve. We took carbon neutrality as part of our concept in the early design brief when we were talking about how are we going to do this chair, what do we really want to achieve, in addition, of course, to comfort and beauty and all the wonderful things that we build into our product. When we started talking about the sustainability issues, the carbon neutrality came up, and it became a very important part of it.
And, you know, I don't want to give that short shrift, the aesthetics, that appeal that the chair has. I mean, tell me exactly how many different styles or finishes are available in addition to it being carbon neutral.
It's an aluminum frame. The bulk of the chair is aluminum. All the beautiful forms can be made with aluminum because aluminum can be molded, and you can put it into, you can sculpt it. You can sculpt the tool, and then these beautiful, beautiful parts come out of it. And the beauty of it is that aluminum as a polished material is quite stunning on its own, but then we have lots of powder coat finishes on top of that, because powder coat is a sustainable finish as opposed to chrome. We already have the polished aluminum, and then we have numerous colors for the mesh back. It's translucent, so it adds to the feeling of the chair being neutral. It's just kind of less is more in many cases. And the aluminum itself is beautiful material to use, because aluminum is one of those perfect materials for closed loop. Once aluminum is aluminum, you can melt it down and make exactly the same product again out of the same material. So it's the perfect recyclable closed loop material, and that's why we like to use it.
Clearly your commitment and passion about sustainability is, I mean, it's amazing. It's very notable and has been for a long time. What's your vision for Keelauer moving forward?
The industry, certainly carbon is one of the things that we're talking about frequently, but the other side of it is material transparency. So carbon neutrality, or moving even to carbon negative. And material transparency is a huge direction for the industry and for us. And it's a tough one, because it's like with food, where you have on the box, it tells you all of the ingredients. We're going to start talking about the ingredients that are in our chair. What do we use to make our product? We're very, very close to having all of our product be red list free, which is the list that has come out of California that talks about products that are carcinogenic and have high toxicity. So all of our new products, including Swerve, are red list free, and we're slowly, I'm going to say quickly, but slowly getting to the point where I think we're 95% red list free with all of our other product. And that's you have to get down to the minutia of the product. You have to dig really, really deep into your supply chain, and have the supply chain dig into the materials and tell you exactly what the content is. And then we make choices once we know, and we're making the right choices, I believe.
And like you said, I love that you said that you used the word transparency, because I think that that's going to be extremely important for everyone going forward, so that you know what you're dealing with. But I also love that you've explained, you know, when we spoke previously, that you use that even in tracking or tracing your materials and the chemicals that are used, and that make sure that everything is non-toxic.
Mm-hmm.
from the very beginning.
Right. So we do life cycle analysis on all of our product, and in fact with Swerve it was an important part of it, because for us to be carbon neutral, we had to identify the process of manufacturing from cradle to grave, as they say. And so it goes right back to the mining of the material and how much is used and where is it mined and where is the product made, and then how do you, when you're actually making parts, where are they made, and transportation and all of those wonderful things. So you really have to identify everything that goes into the process and into the product in order to make the decisions as to what you can eliminate or reduce or reuse or recycle, where it's going to go when the end of life. All of those factors come into play, and unless you know that, you can't make the right decisions. It's really lots of homework.
Well, I'm glad you took it on, especially, you know, for this specific, look, I know you do this for other products, but task chairs are so critical. They're a staple of any workspace. So this innovation, I think, will have a huge impact, especially now that the conversation about ways to reduce buildings' carbon footprints has expanded to include the choices that are made by interior designers and furnishings and fixtures, and not just building materials. So it's really, truly great to now have this option of a carbon neutral office chair.
Yeah, we think so. We're really proud of it. We put the effort into it, and it feels really good to have a product that looks good, sits well, satisfies the need that it is required of. It fills the need that it's trying to work at in the office. And also, when we look at it, we can really feel good that we've built a pretty sustainable product.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you for joining us for Metropolis Sustainable Product Spotlight with Keelauer.
Keilhauer has been a design activist from our start in 1981. We are constantly working toward our goal of closed-loop manufacturing, a process in which all materials are recycled back into the system. Our goal is to be 100% free of toxic chemicals in all of our products. We work to design these chemicals out of our products during the design process. We designed the buncha table with the intent to remove the PVC edge band because it's a toxic plastic. Our Sky Stool is 100% Red List compliant. The whole chair was fully assessed and approved for use. The chrome cylinder was specifically chromed with safe approved chromium. We believe that there is no end to a product's life. That's why we offer a product take-back for our Tom chair. You ship it back to us, we break down the various parts, and we recycle. Striving for a closed-loop manufacturing process means we want to be a part of the recycling loop in every way we can. A key example are the bodies of the Doko stools. Recycled material makes up to 60% of each model. Fabric cutting and pattern matching procedures often create a lot of waste. We produce less waste with our techniques. Keilhauer's top priority is our environmental impact, and this mission remains at the heart of our design process, creating sustainable products.
We're so happy to be able to observe Earth Day with you today with Keilhauer. I'm Avi Rajagopal, Editor-in-Chief of Metropolis, and with me today is Josie Bate, Sustainability Officer at Keilhauer. Josie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Avi. It's my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here.
Today, we're here to talk about carbon neutrality, a very important goal for us in the architecture and design industry as we head towards that all-important deadline of 2030. Several years ago, we all knew, we've known for some time now, that in order for us to avoid the irreversible consequences of climate change, we have to make sure that all new construction is carbon neutral by 2030, and that we move all the built environment, the entirety of the built environment, to carbon neutrality by 2050. Of course, lots of folks are making huge strides towards that, but the role that the built environment has to play in climate change is only becoming clearer and clearer as we move towards that 2030 deadline. Today, we're here to share with you, Josie and I, some amazing resources and information on how you can start to make that change in your own work. Josie, tell us a little bit about your thinking behind even creating this resource for designers.
Keilhauer just thinks it's so important to have a carbon neutral product for designers to specify in low carbon builds. But we know it's a challenge to figure out what's carbon neutral, how to find that online, what documentation there is, where to access it from manufacturers. So it's just going to be really, really great, really helpful for us to share our insight on what we've learned and how to access that documentation.
Absolutely. Just to remind everyone, we in the built environment have a huge responsibility. Nearly 40% of all the world's carbon emissions are contributed by the work that we do here in the building sector. And at least 11% of that at this moment comes from building materials and construction. That is what we call embodied carbon. If you think about the carbon footprint of the building industry as a whole, the energy that we use and the carbon emissions that we put in the air, to keep our buildings running, we generally refer to that as operational carbon. And all the energy and the carbon emissions that we create in order to, extract materials out of the earth, process that material through different manufacturing processes, and then ship it to the site of the building and actually make it available for use in a building. There's so many carbon emissions that have already been made at every step of that process. And that is what we call embodied carbon. As you can see, our annual embodied carbon footprint of the building industry is at about 28%, a little bit more in the quarter. And here's the kicker: as buildings get more efficient, as we switch to greener sources of energy, which hopefully we're doing now all over the world, that building operations piece is going to get smaller and smaller. By most estimates, by 2050, we should be getting to about a half and half mix of embodied and operational carbon for our buildings, which means that embodied piece is going to become more and more important for us to address as designers as we move forward. And that's where manufacturers like Keilhauer come in. So Josie, can you tell us a little bit about how you calculate and verify your embodied carbon?
Yeah, so for our Swerve chair, which we just released as carbon neutral, this is a cradle to grave life cycle of a chair. But as Keilhauer, as a manufacturer, we have to consider carbon emissions throughout the entire life cycle of the chair. So that includes material pre-processing. So like you mentioned, wood, metals, plastics. So all of the emissions from harvesting that and processing it into the final component, we take that into consideration in the life cycle assessment. Then we look at production. So how do our facilities operate? We've been undergoing a number of sustainable initiatives basically since Keilhauer was founded. And this includes strengthening our building envelope, purchasing renewable energy for all of our electricity, efficient upgrades in our equipment. So that's taken into consideration in the production stage. And then this is all calculating and verifying the embodied carbon throughout distribution, use, and end of life. So in the life cycle assessments, the calculations will look at distributing the chair from Keilhauer all the way to the end user. So this is mainly by truck. And then there is a use phase, but for chairs, this use phase is not applicable because the chair doesn't emit carbon during its use. Some other products will have carbon emissions in its use phase, but not our chair. And then end of life. So can this chair be disassembled? Is the product able to be recycled? And how much of it ends up in landfill? So what's the carbon emissions in that stage?
Right. And that's really interesting, right? I mean, when we think about the carbon emissions to create a chair, and then of course those carbon emissions used to create, distribute, and then move that chair to the site, those contributing to the embodied carbon emissions of your project, right? So if you're trying to create a carbon neutral project, we have to think about the embodied carbon emissions of every single piece that's coming in. And what's interesting here is, of course, it gives you this amazing overview of all the things that you need to care about in terms of the carbon emissions. So you have to think about, where the materials for those products that you're selecting are coming from. You have to think about how they're produced, how they're distributed, how they're going to be used. For example, in the case of a lamp, which uses energy over its life, a chair isn't plugged in, but a sit-stand table might be, right? And then what happens to that product at the end of life, as in, when that project gets renovated in 5 years, right? What's going to happen to those chairs, right? So those are the kinds of things that we do have to take into consideration. And to do that, for every product that you select in a project, there are two very important and useful tools for you to look at, which is the LCA and the EPD. The LCA is a life cycle assessment, and the EPD is an environmental product declaration. So what's the difference between an LCA and an EPD? Both provide information about the carbon footprint of products, but they have some key differences, right? So first of all, they follow different standards, and LCAs are undertaken by companies to assess the life cycle of their products, but an LCA is something that you might undertake as well to assess the life cycle of your project. There are tools to do that nowadays. And LCAs tend to be very detailed. They're usually confidential, created by the company, by whatever company, to kind of assess their own footprint or their own impact. EPDs are a little different. EPDs are, while they also include embodied carbon data, they are usually a summary, so they're easy to digest. They are usually available freely. That's the whole point of making a declaration. And of course, they're governed by a different standard. And both LCAs and EPDs likely will also provide a number called global warming potential, which is typically an estimate of the total carbon emissions for the product and how that's going to contribute to global warming. So let's talk a little bit about, take Swerve as an example. And Josie, do you want to walk us through some of the information that's available on Swerve's EPD?
Yeah, I do. So as Avi mentioned, the global warming potential is how we refer to embodied carbon in these documents. And one thing to note is in the life cycle assessment and in the EPD, you'll actually see the total embodied carbon as, say, for example, here, 1.16 times e to the O2. So that's 116 kilograms of carbon. And we know Swerve is carbon neutral, but just based on the rules of how the LCA is put together and verified through the ISO standard, it actually has to say 116 kilograms of carbon. So when you look on the EPD, EPDs are nice because you can list additional information. So the carbon neutrality information would be on the EPD. So it will say, how it's offset and how that's verified. But these reports will still list the global warming potential throughout all of those stages, the cradle to grave stages that we discussed before in this format. So it'll break up the total into raw material, production, distribution, disposal.
And I think that's really important. Thanks for pointing that out, Josie. So in LCA, you will certainly see a minimum carbon footprint even for a carbon neutral product, because an LCA is an assessment of that product and it doesn't necessarily take into account all the things that you can do to offset that carbon, which brings us to carbon offsets. Josie, so tell us about how Swerve gets to carbon neutral, which I think is a great way of explaining, how people can understand what are the factors that go into assessing a product for carbon neutrality. So explain to us how Swerve gets to carbon neutral.
Yeah, when Swerve was designed, we designed the chair with low carbon features in mind. So we selected recycled materials, reduced waste wherever possible. We have efficient transportation methods, efficient production methods. But even when all of these efforts are taken into account, there's just inevitably carbon left over. Especially we see in the materials phase, the chunk of it comes from that phase. So 97 kilograms of carbon emitted in this life cycle phase. So how we decided to get to carbon neutral was to offset all of that carbon with carbon offsets. And we're using an organization called carbonfund.org to help verify that and purchase offsets through. And it's nice because since we know the carbon emissions come from the materials phase and the transport phase, we're able to purchase carbon offsets that relate to that. So for example, like electrifying the transit, the truck stops, or investing in reforestation carbon offsets to kind of target those areas that we are emitting carbon in. At the end of the day for Swerve, inevitably there's embodied carbon. And so we decided to offset the remainder with carbon offsets.
That's again another important point. If you're looking at any product, right, that is going to be carbon neutral or carbon negative or carbon positive, like, if there's any kind of carbon claim made in relationship with a product or material, you should look at the EPDs to understand, where those offsets are being made. And in the case of Swerve, of course, what's fantastic is the offsets are related to the places that have the largest footprint. Now, of course, at the end of the day, we all want to get to carbon neutral anyhow. And so, all methods, I suppose, are great, but the more we can have that link in general between offsets and where the footprint is, the better it is, because we're actually addressing those systems and cycles of carbon specifically. And so that's another fantastic thing about the Swerve chair, and it forms a great example. Josie, this is of course about Swerve, and you've been through, as Keilhauer Sustainability Officer, a long journey of assessing and then offsetting and being able to kind of bring Swerve to carbon neutral. But for everybody else, everybody who's watching today, where else can they go to understand, embodied carbon information, for example, on other products or for the industry as a whole?
It's a good question. We need those tools, right? So if we're looking to make carbon neutral interiors, where is this information located online? Of course, you can go to the manufacturer's website. They should have their life cycle assessments or their EPDs online. But any EPD that's created, the program operator will also have a database on their website. So you could check out the EPD program operator's website, and those are a couple primary sources to get that. But there's also, there's a lot of nice databases that kind of pull together sustainable interiors in one place that you can search for. So like mindful materials is a good one, because you can search for if you want seating or tables and exactly what features you want. There's also an actual carbon footprint column in there, and manufacturers can type in the actual embodied carbon. So specifiers don't even really have to search through the EPD and the LCA to find that. But I find there's also product labels like Living Product Challenge, and they'll list the embodied carbon online. And of course, yeah, just making sure the manufacturer has verified the information is really important. We know it should have like an ISO certified LCA, but how are they verifying carbon neutrality, as you mentioned? You know, is an organization certifying that claim, like carbonfund.org, or maybe an engineer was consulted to verify that claim? Whatever it is, that information should be included.
Thank you, Josie. That's fantastic. There are so many resources that are available to you today, you know, as interior designers and architects practicing to reduce the carbon footprint of your projects. And that's really important for us in this day and age, given the race we're against, you know, getting to carbon neutrality by 2030. But Josie, can you tell us a little bit about, you know, why we should be looking for carbon neutral products in particular, like the Swerve chair in our goal for 2030?
Yeah, definitely. So as we touched upon before, there is a shift to low carbon builds, but there's the operational carbon and the embodied carbon, and naturally the operational carbon will get reduced over time due to electrifying the grid. And so I think it's really important to target the embodied carbon portion of buildings, especially just going straight to carbon neutral. So if we specify carbon neutral interiors, then automatically the carbon footprint of the interiors will be zero. And so we can hit our 2030 targets on time.
Right, exactly. And that's really important. You know, the UN has said that this is our decade for action, right? Unless we're able to do what we can to get to that carbon neutral by 2030, we're going to have irreversible damage to this planet's ecosystems and to our way of life. And recent research suggests that interior design in particular can be responsible for as much as 1/10 of the world's carbon emissions. This means that, you know, each of you in the work that you do has the real power to move us towards that goal of carbon neutrality. So I urge you, use the resources that are available, use the databases that are available, start to speak the language of carbon, educate yourself about embodied carbon, do what you can do to make the difference that you can make in our world. Thank you so much, Josie, for joining me today. And thank you all so much for joining us on Design TV today for Earth Day. And a huge thank you to Keilhauer for being an amazing partner with us and for really helping us spread the message of carbon neutral design. Remember, you can make a difference. And this Earth Day is a great day for you to resolve to do your bit for people and for planet. Thank you all so much for joining us and have a great Earth Day.